The courtroom was suffocating, packed wall to wall with spectators, reporters, and officers, all waiting for the final verdict. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Owen Carter's face as he sat rigid in the defendant's chair, his hands gripping the wooden armrest so tightly his knuckles turned white. The once respected detective now wore a prison jumpsuit, a stark contrast to the badge he had carried with pride. His breathing was steady, controlled, but inside, his mind raced. He replayed every detail of the trial, every piece of so-called evidence stacked against him. It had been airtight too perfect. The gunshot residue on his hands. The grainy surveillance footage of someone who looked just like him entering the victim's apartment. The witness who swore she saw him there that night. But Owen knew the truth. He had never killed Daniel West. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Martinez's voice cut through the thick silence. The jury foreman, an older man with tired eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." He cleared his throat and unfolded the paper in his hands. In the case of the state versus Owen Carter, on the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant guilty. The word hit like a physical blow. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom, cameras flashing, pens scratching against paper. Owen clenched his jaw as the foreman continued. The jury recommends death by lethal injection. Somewhere in the gallery, a sharp breath was drawn. Ava Sterling, his former partner, sat motionless, her face unreadable. They had worked together for years, trusted each other with their lives, yet now she was nothing but a stranger. Across the aisle, District Attorney Malcolm Rhodes smirked ever so slightly, satisfaction gleaming in his eyes. The bailiffs moved in. Owen forced himself to stand, his legs like lead. His training dictated that he keep his expression neutral, but inside, fury burned. This wasn't justice. This was a setup. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon air was thick with tension. Reporters swarmed like vultures, shoving microphones toward the officers escorting Owen. But as soon as the heavy doors swung open, a sharp bark rang through the crowd. Atlas. The German shepherd's ears stood alert, his powerful frame straining against the leash of his temporary handler. His amber eyes locked onto Owen, his entire body tense. When Owen appeared in cuffs, Atlas let out a deep, frantic bark, yanking forward so hard that the handler nearly lost his grip. "Easy, boy," the man muttered, struggling to restrain him. But Atlas wasn't listening. He barked again, louder this time, his instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. Owen didn't look back as they pushed him into the van. He couldn't. But as the doors slammed shut, the last thing he saw through the reinforced window was Atlas, still pulling, still fighting, still trying to reach him. He had lost everything. His badge, his freedom, his future. But Atlas wasn't giving up on him yet. The prison walls closed in like a vice, thick concrete and steel pressing against Owen Carter as he was led through the long, dimly lit corridor of Blackridge Penitentiary. Every step echoed ominously, the weight of his shackles making his movements sluggish. Inmates lined the walkways above, some watching in silence, others jeering, eager to size up the disgraced detective now condemned to death row. Owen kept his gaze forward, ignoring the taunts, the whispers of pig and cop killer slithering through the air like venom. The heavy metal door groaned as it slid open, revealing his new reality, a 6-by-9-foot concrete box with nothing but a thin mattress, a metal toilet, and a small slit of reinforced glass that barely passed for a window. The guard behind him chuckled. "Welcome home, Carter." The cuffs were unlocked, and Owen flexed his wrists, shaking off the numbness before stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind him with a deafening clang, sealing his fate. He turned, scanning every inch of the cell, already cataloging potential weaknesses, anything he could use to his advantage. But there was nothing. Just cold, unyielding walls. He sat on the cot, exhaling slowly, forcing his mind to steady itself. He had been trained to survive, to adapt, but nothing in his years as a detective had prepared him for this. Outside, the prison buzzed with routine. Meals were served on metal trays, slid through a narrow slot at the bottom of the door. The food was barely edible gray, tasteless, the consistency of paste. He forced himself to eat anyway, knowing he would need his strength. At night, the silence was fractured by the distant shouts of inmates, the occasional scream of someone losing whatever fragile grip they had left. Owen stared at the ceiling, his thoughts circling the same question over and over. Who did this to him? Who went to such lengths to frame him so perfectly? The evidence had been airtight, the kind of case he himself would have considered unbeatable. Across town, in a far more comfortable space, Ava Sterling sat on her couch, unable to sleep. Atlas lay at her feet, his head resting on his paws, eyes flicking toward the door every few minutes as if expecting Owen to walk through it. He refused to eat, refused to settle, pacing the apartment with restless energy that mirrored Ava's own unease. She told herself she was being irrational. The case was closed. The jury had decided. And yet, something gnawed at her. Owen had always been one of the best meticulous methodical. If anyone could have covered their tracks, it was him. So why had the evidence been so perfect? Atlas let out a low whine, ears perking up as he moved toward the window. Ava sighed, rubbing her temples. "He's not coming back, boy," she whispered. But Atlas didn't seem to believe her. Back in Blackridge, Owen's muscles tensed as he heard footsteps approaching. Not the steady, indifferent walk of a guard, but something else. A slow, deliberate rhythm. A shadow passed outside his cell. Then, a voice low, rough. "You're a dead man, Carter." The figure moved on, but the meaning was clear. He wasn't just facing execution by the state. Someone in here wanted him gone before that could happen. Lying back on the thin mattress, Owen closed his eyes, feeling the burn of frustration coil in his chest. He was running out of time. If he didn't find a way to fight back soon, he wouldn't live long enough to see his own execution. Ava Sterling had spent years following her instincts, and right now, they were screaming at her. She sat at her desk, staring at the open case file, flipping through the same pieces of evidence she had reviewed 100 times before. The security footage, the forensic reports, the witness statements, it all fit too perfectly, too conveniently. She wanted to believe that Owen was guilty. It would make things easier, cleaner. But deep down, she knew something was off. Atlas paced restlessly across her apartment, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor, pausing every so often to stare at the door, waiting. He hadn't eaten properly in days, barely drank any water, and every time Ava tried to reassure him, he would only whine and go back to the door like he was expecting Owen to return. It was irrational, and yet, the damn dog was making her uneasy. She finally gave in with an exhausted sigh, grabbing her jacket and Atlas's leash. "Fine. You want to go out? Let's go." The second she opened the door, Atlas lunged forward, almost yanking the leash from her grip. "Whoa, slow down," she muttered, trying to control him, but the dog had his own agenda. He dragged her through the quiet streets, his nose to the ground, moving with a purpose that sent a chill down Ava's spine. He wasn't just looking for a place to relieve himself, he was tracking something. And then she realized where they were heading. The docks. It had been weeks since she'd been here, not since the initial investigation when Daniel West's body was found. The crime scene had long been cleared, the case closed, but Atlas didn't seem to care. He led her straight to a section near a loading bay, sniffing the ground frantically before stopping abruptly, letting out a sharp bark. Ava frowned, kneeling beside him. "What is it, boy?" She ran her hands over the cold concrete, her fingers brushing against something rough. A scrap of fabric, partially buried beneath a layer of dirt. Dark, singed at the edges. She lifted it, turning it over in her hands, and immediately, her heart rate spiked. It was thick, industrial-grade material, the kind used in police tactical gear. Ava stood, scanning the area. The forensic team had combed this place thoroughly, but they had been looking for evidence tied directly to the murder. Had they missed this, or had someone planted it after the fact? She snapped a quick picture on her phone, then pulled out an evidence bag from her jacket, sealing the fabric inside. Atlas continued sniffing, his body tense, tail rigid. Whatever had happened here, it wasn't over. By the time they returned to her apartment, Ava's mind was spinning. She placed the evidence bag on her desk, staring at it like it might provide answers on its own. She needed to test it, compare it to department-issued gear, but she already knew what she would find. Someone with police training had been here the night of the murder, and that someone wasn't Owen. Across the city, inside the suffocating walls of Blackridge, Owen sat in the darkness of his cell, his back against the cold concrete. He hadn't slept. Every sound in the prison felt amplified, the distant shouts, the clang of metal doors, the rustling of fabric as inmates shifted in their bunks. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. He wasn't on the outside looking in anymore. He was the target. And if he didn't start figuring things out soon, he was going to die in here. Ava Sterling sat in her car outside the precinct, her fingers tapping impatiently against the steering wheel. The fabric scrap she found at the docks was now sealed in an evidence bag on the passenger seat, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was the key to something much bigger. She had spent the last hour going through department records, comparing materials, and there was no doubt this was police-issued tactical gear. Someone from the force had been at that crime scene, and they had been close enough to the fire to leave behind a burnt fragment of their uniform. The question was who? Atlas sat in the back seat, his ears alert, eyes locked on the entrance of the station, as if he, too, sensed the weight of what they were about to do. Ava exhaled sharply, grabbed the evidence bag, and stepped out of the car. Inside, the precinct buzzed with the usual chaos, officers filing reports, suspects being processed, phones ringing non-stop. Ava moved with purpose, ignoring the sideways glances from her former colleagues. She had been keeping her distance since Owen's conviction, not because she believed he was guilty, but because doubting the system that had raised her was something she wasn't ready to confront. Until now. She found forensics tech Martin Chun in the lab, hunched over a microscope. He barely looked up when she walked in. "You here to ask about Cooper again? Because if so, don't waste your breath. The case is closed." Ava tossed the evidence bag onto his desk. "Not yet, it isn't." Chun sighed, pulling off his gloves before picking up the bag and inspecting its contents. "What am I looking at?" "Found that at the docks, near where West was murdered. It's police-grade tactical gear, burnt at the edges. I need to know if it matches any active officers' uniforms." Chun frowned. "If this was at the scene, why didn't forensics find it?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," she said, folding her arms. Chun hesitated, then finally nodded. "Give me a few hours." Ava left the lab, but her instincts told her not to wait idly. Instead, she found a quiet corner and pulled up Daniel West's case files on her phone. West had been a journalist, one who had made enemies before, but his last few stories had been focused on one thing: police corruption. Specifically, within their own department. His notes, scattered and incomplete, hinted at a major scandal, something he had been close to exposing before he was silenced. The more she read, the colder her blood ran. Names were redacted, but she recognized enough of the details to piece things together. Someone inside the department had been dirty, and West had been onto them. And now, that same someone had made sure Owen took the fall for his murder. Her phone buzzed. A message from Chun. "Meet me in the parking garage, now." Ava's stomach tightened. She pushed through the station, making her way downstairs to the underground parking lot. Chun was already waiting near the stairwell, his expression grim. He held up the evidence bag. "You were right. This fabric matches the uniforms issued to the Tactical Response Unit. TRU?" Ava's pulse quickened. That unit was handpicked, elite, and heavily protected. If someone from TRU was involved, this went deep. "That's not the worst part," Chun added, lowering his voice. "I ran the serial number. The uniform this came from was issued to someone high up. Someone untouchable." Ava's throat went dry. "Who?" Chun hesitated, glancing around before handing her a folded piece of paper. Ava opened it, her heart pounding as she read the name. Deputy Chief Marcus Holloway. Everything clicked into place. Holloway had been West's main target. He had the power to control evidence, manipulate investigations, and most damning of all, he had personally overseen Owen's arrest. If he had been at the crime scene, that meant one thing. Holloway had framed Owen. Ava clenched her jaw. She had spent years believing in the system, trusting the badge, but now, that trust had shattered. Someone had to take Holloway down. And she knew exactly where to start. Ava gripped the steering wheel tighter as she sped through the dimly lit streets, her mind racing just as fast as the car. The name Marcus Holloway burned in her thoughts like a brand, each syllable dripping with corruption. She had suspected something was wrong with the case, but this? A deputy chief involved in framing one of their own? It was bigger than she imagined. And worse, if Holloway knew she was digging, she was already in danger. Atlas shifted in the back seat, ears pricked, sensing her tension. The city lights flickered past as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. "Noah, I need you," she said the second he picked up. A groggy voice on the other end grumbled. "Ava? It's 2 in the morning. What the hell? I don't have time to explain. I need you to pull everything on Marcus Holloway. Bank records, personal calls, off-the-books activity. If it exists, I want it." A beat of silence. Then a resigned sigh. "Give me an hour." She hung up and made a sharp turn onto a side street, pulling into the shadows of an abandoned lot. If Holloway had really orchestrated this, she needed more than just a name. She needed undeniable proof. And that meant going back to where it all started, the docks. The waterfront was eerily quiet when she arrived. Atlas leapt from the car the second she opened the door, his body tense, nose to the ground. She followed him past rusted shipping containers, her flashlight sweeping across cracked pavement and broken glass. Every instinct told her she wasn't alone. She reached the spot where she had found the burnt fabric, crouching low to scan the ground. Atlas suddenly stiffened. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Ava's pulse spiked. She followed his gaze to a nearby stack of wooden crates. Something was wedged beneath them, barely visible under the flickering glow of a distant street lamp. She reached for it, fingers brushing against something cold, metallic. Carefully she pulled it free. A spent bullet casing. Her breath caught. This hadn't been logged in the case files. The official report stated that only a single round had been recovered, the one that killed Daniel West. But this casing was different. Different caliber. Different weapon. Someone else had fired a shot that night, and the evidence had been buried. Her phone buzzed. "Noah, you're not going to like this," he said, his voice suddenly very awake. "I traced some offshore accounts linked to Holloway. 3 days after West's murder, a payment of $200,000 was wired to an unnamed recipient." Ava clenched her fist. A hit. "Not just that," Noah continued. "West wasn't the only target. Someone else was supposed to die that night." The realization hit her like ice water. Owen had been the second target. But instead of killing him outright, Holloway had set him up. A cleaner solution. No loose ends. Ava swallowed hard, shoving the casing into an evidence bag. The walls were closing in. Holloway had covered his tracks well, but not perfectly. And now, she had something he hadn't expected. Proof. The problem? He would do anything to keep it buried. She stood, turning back toward her car, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood up before she even heard the sound. A rustle. Footsteps. She wasn't alone. Owen Carter sat on the edge of his cot, staring at the cold concrete floor of his cell, his mind a whirlwind of calculations and worst-case scenarios. The warning he'd received days ago still rang in his ears. "You're a dead man, Carter." He had seen it happen before, inmates disappearing overnight, accidents that weren't accidents at all. If they wanted him gone, it wasn't a matter of if, it was when. His execution date was set, but something told him he wouldn't make it that far. Someone wanted him silenced before the truth could ever come out. His only way out of here was to escape, and he was running out of time. He had spent weeks studying the guards' rotations, the way they moved, who took smoke breaks, who was lazy, who was corrupt. Landon Green was the worst of them, always watching Owen too closely, always lingering a second too long, as if waiting for an opportunity. But tonight, Green's attention was elsewhere. A fight had broken out 2 cell blocks down, shouting. The clang of metal on metal, chaos. And Owen saw his chance. The moment the alarms blared, he moved. He had palmed a stolen shiv days ago, a jagged piece of metal filed down to a lethal point. But he didn't need to use it. Green was too distracted. Owen waited until the guard turned his back, then lunged. His forearm locked around Green's throat, squeezing tight, cutting off his air before he could make a sound. The man thrashed, elbows slamming into Owen's ribs, but Owen held firm, dragging him into the shadows of the dimly lit corridor. When Green's struggles slowed, Owen pried the keycard from his belt and let him drop to the floor, unconscious but alive. His heart pounded as he swiped the keycard over the scanner. A beep. A green light. He was in. He moved quickly, staying low, sticking to the blind spots between security cameras. The prison was chaos now, guards trying to contain the riot while sirens wailed through the walls. He passed an empty control station and hesitated. This was dangerous. Reckless. But if he wanted to buy himself more time, he needed to make sure no one could lock the place down before he was out. He scanned the control panel, searching there. The override for the cell doors. He pressed it. A loud mechanical hiss filled the prison as dozens of cell doors slid open at once. Shouts erupted as inmates flooded into the corridors, some fighting, others running for any way out. It was a disaster for the guards, but perfect for Owen. He blended into the chaos, moving fast, dodging fights, ignoring the mayhem around him. The exit was close now. Just a few more feet. Then came the gunfire. A guard spotted him, raised his rifle, and fired. Owen dove behind a concrete pillar, shards of brick exploding in the air as bullets slammed into the walls around him. He had no weapon, no armor. He needed another way. He spotted a utility ladder leading up toward the maintenance catwalks. Without hesitating, he sprinted for it, climbing fast. Another shot rang out, grazing his shoulder, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Above him, a skylight. His only way out. He reached the top and grabbed a rusted pipe, swinging his body onto the narrow ledge. The skylight was locked, but a few kicks sent the glass shattering outward. Cold night air rushed in, and for the first time in weeks, he could see the stars. Freedom. Almost. Owen hoisted himself through the opening, just as more guards burst onto the catwalk behind him. A final shot rang out, missing by inches as he dropped onto the rooftop below. His landing was rough. Pain exploded in his ankle, but he pushed forward, limping as he ran. The perimeter fence loomed ahead, tall and lined with razor wire. No time to hesitate. He sprinted, ignoring the fire in his lungs, the distant sound of alarms still blaring behind him. He leapt. Pain ripped through his side as the razor wire tore at his jumpsuit, slicing into his skin, but he didn't stop. He rolled over the top, ignoring the sting, and hit the ground hard on the other side. Then he ran. Black Ridge Penitentiary faded behind him, distant shouts growing weaker as he disappeared into the darkness. For the first time since his arrest, Owen Carter was free. Ava barely had time to react when the figure emerged from the shadows, staggering toward her with uneven steps. Her gun was already in her hand before her mind caught up, heart pounding as she aimed, her breath sharp in the cold night air. Then the figure stepped under the streetlight, and her grip tightened. Owen. He looked like hell, his jumpsuit torn, streaks of dried blood smeared across his arm, one side of his face bruised and swollen. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with something raw, desperate, and undeniable. "Put the gun down, Ava." His voice was hoarse, low, edged with exhaustion. "Not a chance," she shot back, her mind racing. She had spent the last few days uncovering evidence that pointed to his innocence, but seeing him here, free, a fugitive, it changed everything. "You escaped from death row. Do you have any idea what they'll do to you now?" "I didn't have a choice," he growled, taking a step closer. Ava didn't move. Atlas, who had been at her side, let out a sharp bark before bounding toward Owen, tail wagging wildly as if his entire body was vibrating with relief. Owen knelt, running a hand over the German shepherd's fur, and for a brief second, something in his face cracked relief, exhaustion, gratitude all bleeding into one. But then his gaze snapped back to Ava. "I need your help." Ava inhaled slowly, her instincts warring with the years of training drilled into her. Owen was a fugitive. If she turned him in, she might still have a chance to fix things from the inside. But if she let him go, everything she had discovered about Holloway, about the case, about the lies, she knew it wouldn't matter. The system wasn't designed to fix itself. And Holloway would make sure Owen never saw another trial. She lowered the gun. "You need to prove Holloway set you up," she said, voice steady. "And you don't have much time." Owen nodded once, his jaw tight. "I know." They moved quickly. Ava led him through back alleys, avoiding street cameras, staying in the shadows. Owen limped, his movements stiff, but he kept up without complaint. When they finally reached her apartment, she triple-locked the door and pulled the blinds shut. Noah was already there, hunched over his laptop, fingers flying over the keyboard. He looked up, eyes widening at the sight of Owen. "Jesus, you actually did it." "No time for reactions," Ava cut in, tossing her jacket onto the couch. "We have proof Holloway was at the docks. But we need more." Noah nodded, pulling up a series of bank transactions on his screen. "I traced the offshore accounts. Holloway made a payment of $200,000 3 days after the murder. He didn't just frame you, Owen. He paid someone to do it." Owen exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Who?" "That's the problem," Noah muttered. "The payment was routed through a shell company. But there's something else. I found deleted files in the department's internal log. Someone inside helped plant the evidence against you." Ava and Owen exchanged a look, tension thick between them. Someone else. Someone high up. And that meant this wasn't just about Holloway. It was bigger. More dangerous. A sharp knock at the door sent Atlas into a frenzy, barking wildly. Ava froze, exchanging a glance with Owen. "Were you followed?" "No," Owen hissed, already moving toward the window, scanning the street below. Noah's fingers flew over his keyboard, checking the building's security cameras. The screen flickered, showing a figure standing in the hallway, partially obscured by shadows. A second later, the feed cut to static. "Shit," Noah muttered. Ava's pulse hammered. If Holloway knew they were here, they had just run out of time. "Ava." grip tightened around her gun as the knock came again, slow and deliberate. Whoever was on the other side wasn't a courier or a lost neighbor. Owen moved soundlessly to the kitchen, grabbing a knife from the counter, his muscles taut. Atlas stood between them and the door, his ears pinned back, growling low and deep. "Noah," Ava whispered. "How many exits?" Noah's fingers flew over the keyboard, sweat beading at his temple. "Back alley. Fire escape leads down to a side street." Owen shook his head. "Too exposed. If they know we're here, they'll have men waiting." The knock turned into a heavy thud. The door wouldn't hold. Ava moved fast, grabbing the laptop and shoving it into a duffel bag. "We take the basement." Owen nodded. "Go. I'll stall them." "Not happening," Ava snapped. "You're the fugitive, remember? They shoot you on sight. We go together." The woods splintered behind them. No time. They sprinted for the back hallway, Atlas bounding ahead. Noah yanked open the basement hatch, nearly tripping over himself in the process. Ava went down first, gun raised, sweeping the dark, musty space. Owen followed, pulling the hatch shut behind him just as the apartment door crashed open. Heavy boots pounded above them. "They were here," a voice barked. "Find them." Ava's heart pounded. They had seconds. Noah pointed toward an old maintenance door leading to the underground parking garage. They pushed through, emerging between rows of abandoned cars. The garage was silent, the only sound their ragged breathing. Then headlights flared to life. Engines roared as 3 black SUVs blocked the exits, their doors flying open as men in tactical gear poured out, guns raised. "Drop it," one of them shouted. Ava's finger tensed on the trigger. Owen raised his hand slightly, shifting just enough to put himself between her and the gunman. Atlas bared his teeth, ready to lunge. Then a voice rang out, cold and familiar. Well, look what we have here." Marcus Holloway stepped from the SUV, dressed in a crisp suit, untouched by the chaos around him. He adjusted his cufflinks like this was just another business meeting. "Detective Sterling," he mused, eyes flicking to Owen. "And our very own fugitive. You've made quite the mess." Ava kept her gun steady. "We have enough to bury you." Holloway chuckled. "Do you?" He gestured lazily to the men surrounding them. "Because it looks to me like you've run out of time." His smirk deepened. "You know, Ava, I actually liked you. Shame you had to go sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Owen's voice was like steel. "The truth's coming out, Holloway." Holloway sighed, shaking his head. "No, Carter. You still don't get it." He turned to the nearest officer. "Take the shot." Everything exploded at once. Ava fired first, her bullet slamming into the leg of the closest gunman. Owen moved in a blur, tackling another to the ground before he could fire. Atlas leapt, his powerful jaws clamping onto a man's arm, dragging him down with a pained scream. Gunfire roared through the garage. Noah dove behind a car, typing frantically on his laptop. "Cover me," he shouted. Ava dropped low, squeezing off 2 more shots, forcing the remaining gunman to scatter. Owen disarmed one, slamming him against the hood of a car before turning to Holloway. But Holloway wasn't running. He was smiling. Then Owen saw it. A small detonator in Holloway's hand. "Oh, you didn't think I came unprepared, did you?" Holloway sneered. "This entire garage is wired." He pressed the button. Nothing happened. Holloway's smirk faltered. Noah grinned from behind the car, holding up his laptop. "Yeah, sorry about that. I hacked your little fireworks show." Owen didn't hesitate. He lunged, his fist colliding with Holloway's jaw, sending him crashing to the concrete. Holloway gasped, reaching for his gun, but Owen kicked it away. "This is over." Sirens blared outside. SWAT vehicles screeched to a halt, doors flying open as officers stormed in. Ava turned toward them, badge in hand. "Marcus Holloway is under arrest." For the first time, Holloway's composure cracked. "You think this ends with me?" He spat, blood trickling from his lip. "You have no idea how deep this goes." Ava's voice was ice. "We'll find out." Holloway's men dropped their weapons as SWAT secured the scene. The nightmare was over. Or so they thought. The flashing red and blue lights painted the underground garage in streaks of color as Marcus Holloway was shoved into the back of a squad car, his hands cuffed behind him, his expression twisted into something between rage and disbelief. Owen stood motionless, his breathing heavy, watching as the man who had orchestrated his downfall was finally taken away. It should have felt like a victory, but something inside him remained tense, unsettled. Holloway had been powerful, but he hadn't worked alone. His final words still echoed in Owen's mind. "You think this ends with me?" The corruption went deeper, and they all knew it. Ava holstered her weapon, rubbing at the bruise forming along her ribs from the fight. Atlas, still hyped from the confrontation, trotted to Owen's side, pressing his head against his leg. Owen let out a breath, running a hand through the dog's fur, grounding himself in the moment. He had spent so long trapped, waiting, suffocating under the weight of a crime he hadn't committed. And now, for the first time, he was free. But freedom didn't come without a cost. Noah jogged up, his laptop tucked under one arm, grinning despite the cut on his forehead. "Just so you know, I sent every bit of data I pulled on Holloway to multiple news outlets. By morning, the whole city's going to know exactly what he was up to." Ava smirked. "Good. No way they can bury this now." The cleanup was swift. SWAT teams secured the remaining men, officers collected statements, and forensics cataloged the bullet casings and detonator as evidence. Owen and Ava sat on the hood of a police cruiser, exhaustion settling into their bones as the adrenaline wore off. "So what happens now?" Owen asked, watching as Holloway's car disappeared into the night. Ava sighed, stretching her sore muscles. "Holloway's trial will be a circus. The department's going to pretend they had no idea what was happening under their noses. They'll make a few arrests, suspend some officers, slap a few wrists. But the real players? They'll go underground until the heat dies down." Owen shook his head. "Not if we keep digging." Ava glanced at him, something unreadable in her expression. "You really want to do this? After everything?" He exhaled, staring up at the night sky. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking at it through a barred window. "I don't know how to do anything else." The next few weeks passed in a blur. The department, desperate to save face, fast-tracked Owen's exoneration. His conviction was overturned, and he was officially cleared of all charges. They offered him his old job back, a shiny badge, and a clean slate. He turned it down without hesitation. The system had failed him once. He wasn't about to put his faith in it again. Instead, he found himself standing in front of a small, unassuming office downtown, the glass door marked Sterling Investigations in bold black lettering. Ava leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, a knowing smirk on her face. "Took you long enough," she said as Atlas trotted over, tail wagging. Owen rolled his eyes but stepped inside. The office was small, 2 desks, a cluttered whiteboard, stacks of files, and a pot of coffee that smelled strong enough to wake the dead. It wasn't a police precinct, but it felt right. "You sure about this?" he asked. Ava shrugged. "Someone has to pick up the cases the cops won't touch." Owen looked down at Atlas, who had already claimed a spot near the window, watching the world outside like a silent sentinel. "Well," Owen muttered, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips, "guess we better get to work." And just like that, a new chapter began.